So I have some questions for you to start off with.
Okay.
Okay. So what can you tell me about the Red Scare and how it affected you?
Well, by the Red Scare, do you mean the Cuban Missile Crisis? Is that what you mean?
The Red Scare,
or
kind
the Red
of like,
Scare with the Red Chinese, or what?
like the Communist Scare.
Didn't affect me at all. I never was scared of that.
No?
No,
Okay.
we didn't have to worry about that.
Okay. What were your feelings about the Soviet Union and nuclear arms at the time of the Cuban Missile Crisis?
Well, I think everybody had a certain concern about that, of course, because it was really scarifying, and the world almost, the world could have come to an end then. We don't know now. We didn't know then what we know now, but it was, really a relatively close call. I can remember thinking, wow, from Cuba to New Orleans, that's not that far for a missile. But we didn't worry. We don't know anybody who thought about trying to go underground or anything like that.
Yeah.
We didn't think about it a lot.
Okay. So the Soviet Union, you were just kind of like, it wasn't a big deal to you, really?
Well, now let's see. What was the year? Was it 1960? What?
1962, I think.
So 1962. So I was 30 years old, and it was in 62, and your mother wasn't born until 65.
Right.
So we had two children, and we later had two more. So we were thinking more about kids than we were about having our life threatened. But you know what was interesting? My old executive officer on my ship that I was on in my day in the Navy, he had command of a destroyer during the Cuban Missile Crisis.
Oh, really?
And he went down, his ship went down there, and they escorted one of the ships carrying missiles back out.
Wow.
He really did. It was at the Forest Royal, and he had a big job. That's exciting, isn't it?
Yeah, that's like really interesting.
It really is.
One of my questions was actually about having young children, because I know that we learned in class that kids specifically, were taught in school how to duck and cover, and it was kind of it was almost like propaganda, like they had it on TV, and there were commercials.
That might be, but I never heard of those kind of conversations.
Really?
I really didn't. Yeah, I don't think there was any fear around here.
Because the purpose of this whole project is kind of to apply what we've learned, because there've been all these documentaries that we watched and stuff in textbooks, and so the whole point of this project is to see the differences of how things really were and how we learn how they were. So the whole point is like to get the perspective of someone who lived through it. You know
that there have been meetings between the Americans and the Russians as alumni talking about their experiences 30 years ago and so forth and so on.
Really?
Yeah. And I don't know whether the meetings took place in Havana or whether they were in the States, but people got together, people on our side, diplomats and generals and admirals and the counterparts from Russia, and they sat down and exchanged stories and realized how very, very close we were to something really terrible happening.
Yeah.
So I think everything is pretty well known about it right now, but of course nobody could be sure of it at that time.
Yeah.
And there was one guy particular, I think, in history, one guy who'll go down in history as a guy that really kept something bad from happening, which was the president's brother.
Yeah.
Because the admirals, the generals were, let's go, let's take them out, we'll go to war. And Bobby Kennedy kept saying, no, it could be too costly, we can't do it, we've got to try to negotiate or bluff or do whatever. And he stood in the way. He stood up to guys that were really older and much senior to him in experience.
So one thing that we learned about in class was that Cuba was kind of like how Florida is now. Everybody would vacation there, and that it was like the spot to go to for the summer to the beach and on the holidays and stuff.
What, for Americans?
Yes.
Well, I don't think that, but people went down there. I mean, I can remember.
Had you ever been there?
I was there in the Navy in good times, and that was before Castro. So we saw Havana when it was full of tourists. That's absolutely true. And the most famous American involved with Cuba always was Ernest Hemingway, whom I shook hands with down there.
Oh, really?
At his favorite bar with his wife, Mary.
That's really cool.
It is. And people would fly down, particularly from New Orleans. People would fly down there from here and spend the weekend down there and so forth. I can remember my father and mother going down there probably for an anniversary and and had a nice time. So people didn't go there and do what, they didn't go down there and live like you do at Destin or the like, but they would go down there for a weekend or maybe a week. There was one really nice hotel, and there were a bunch of nightclubs.
Must have been pretty scary though. And
Wasn't scary, it was fun.
all of a sudden though, when things started to change.
Well, it changed. It wasn't all of a sudden, but it changed, and people quit going down there, that's for sure.
I bet people did.
And my ship went down there 3 or 4 times in the 50s, and that was, Batista was making noises up in the mountains, but, rather Castro was, but Batista was still in charge. But you saw Cuban soldiers all over the Havana waterfront.
Okay, let's see what other. Okay, so specifically about the Red Scare, or not the Red Scare, sorry, the Cuban Missile Crisis. Americans didn't actually know that they were being threatened until day 7 of the 13 days.
Okay.
So what did you think of when everybody found out?
Well, the speech was made, wasn't it, by Adlai Stevenson in the United Nations when he when he showed photographs of the military bases down there and showed that there were missiles there to launch. There were missile launchers down there that were threatening this country. Well, I don't think there was a hysteria. I can't recall that there was hysteria, but there was a lot of excitement. There's no doubt about it. And here's the ship coming with the missiles themselves, coming to Cuba, and we had to say, you can't bring that ship into Cuba, and they turned back.
Yeah.
They turned back.
But
it wasn't followed as closely as it would be followed today because we didn't have the news gathering facilities.
Right.
It wasn't nonstop 24-hour news. Today you'd have a camera on that ship the entire time, and you'd see the course plotted over the ocean and so forth. But there was my old executive officer as a commanding officer of a destroyer who was one of the ships that intercepted that ship and said, go back.
Do you remember JFK's televised address to the nation?
Not very much. I don't think I do. And you get confused over the years as to whether you really saw it or whether you saw it in a history film or on the reruns. I don't remember sitting around listening to that being discussed, but I do think I remember pictures of Adlai Stevenson making a presentation to the United Nations showing that here are the missile launchers and we've got to get them out of there.
Were you upset that the government kept it from Americans for so long?
I don't think people thought that way. I'm not too sure exactly what you mean by that, but I don't think there was too much in the way of secrets that way. Okay. I don't think anybody knew as well as the people around the table how close we came.
Yeah. That's
for sure. But, the government had a spy over in Russia who was telling the government that they will blink, they will not. If you bluff them and say you have to turn back, that they will. They were not going to go to war over this. And that, I think that encouraged Kennedy to stand up and say you can't go any further.
Right, okay. Let's see what else. Was there any anti-Russian sentiment in the U.S., for people who were Russian who moved to America, so they're Russian-American?
Right, but we didn't know anybody. I don't think that, but I do remember sometime around then, people would come over on exchange programs, and I remember we were involved in one of those programs, and we took a couple of those Russians to lunch at Antoine's, and that was sort of a feeling, wow, those were maybe bad people, and they had a feeling that they were being followed by the government. They were never really allowed to walk around here without the FBI or somebody really watching them all the time. But there was very little of that. But there was some interchange. There was some exchange of American and Russian citizens.
Okay. Let's see what else. So do you remember October of 1962, which is when the crisis happened? Do you remember that being any different than the rest of that time period? How did anything change?
Well, I think that's a really good question, but I think there was just sort of a sigh of relief. It happened, and then it was reported the ship turned back.
Right.
Big sigh of relief, but I don't think everybody was really ready to run into a missile shelter. But that might have been the case in Florida. They were a lot closer to it. From Havana to Key West is about 90 miles. So I think people in the south of Florida could have been a lot more concerned, but people up here not really.
We learned in that's so funny because we learned in class that people were literally scared for their lives and they thought that they were going to die every day.
But I don't think that was true around here.
That's so
I don't think we
interesting.
had that feeling at all.
Yeah, I mean that's really interesting because we watched this documentary and it showed people literally building hideouts in their basements.
Yeah,
and
I can imagine, but I don't know any here. Well, you can't build a basement in New Orleans.
That's
It's a
true,
hard
that's
thing to
true.
do.
So it was not more of a. It was more of a sigh of relief when it was over.
Oh, big sigh of relief. I don't think anybody realized how close we had really come
Mhm.
to the war. Because had the missiles arrived in Cuba, that doesn't mean they would have been used. But nonetheless, we would have felt much more on the defense
Right.
if they had a gun at our head all the time. But when those ships turned around, that was really an extraordinary moment. But you weren't following it live on CNN
Right.
the way you might now.
Yeah. So it might have been. I think if that would have happened now, it would have been a much bigger deal.
Oh my, yes.
In the sense that the media would have spread it completely.
Well, people would have been much more aware of what was going
Right.
on. Absolutely.
Definitely. Okay. Was there anything else you wanted to add to that, or?
But it was really an interesting time, wasn't it? And think 30 years later, the major players from both countries got together,
Right.
had a nice dinner, had some nice drinks together, and talked about what was going on and how close we came to blowing up the world.
It's so crazy.
Yeah.
To think about. Okay, well, I think that's it. Thank you very much.
Good. Thank you very much.